The way this trim tool works is that it takes as a base object a rail, which is just a series of edges, and then it's going to loft a profile object along the rail. So for my rail, I'm just going to extrude some edges here. And the rail doesn't have to be a single section, it can be made up of multiple sections like this. But one thing you absolutely can't do is have any junctions that are T-shaped like this. Every point needs to have at most two edges coming off of it, or else the tool's not going to work. So I'm going to, under Profile, assign my profile object. And my profile object is also a series of edges. And like the rail, it can be broken up into multiple sections. And any place that we want to have a split in the UVs, we're going to have to do a split in the profile object. And you'll see exactly why later. So I'm going to, under Rail, assign a material that I want to apply. I already have one set up. It's called Trims01 Inst Overlay. This is using a trim sheet texture that I already built that has lots of different trims on it. And as you can see, already we have a problem. A bunch of these faces have normals that are pointing in the wrong direction. And that's because edges in Blender don't inherently have a normal. Blender doesn't know whether the faces that are extruded from this edge should be pointing inwards or should be pointing outwards. So we're going to have to specify that ourselves. And that's why the profile object has this reverse attribute on it. This is a Boolean property that's stored on the edges, and that is plugged in under the profile settings. So I'm going to, for the faces that are flipped, go in and tick reverse on those edges so that now they're pointing in the correct direction. I have set attribute hotkeyed to Control A. I'm going to be using that a lot, so I need it to be easy to access. And this is something that you're going to have to do for every profile object that you make. The good news is that once you set it up, you shouldn't have to edit it too much unless the profile shape changes. You're also going to see that the same thing happens to the rail sometimes. Blender doesn't know whether the rail is flowing clockwise or flowing counterclockwise, and occasionally something will change with the point order or something that just reverses the direction of the rail, which is why the rail also has a reverse attribute stored on the edges that is plugged in under the rail section. And so if your rail is flipped, you can just go in and reverse that section so that it's pointing in the right direction again. And the way this works is that because the attribute is stored on the edge, if even one of the edges has the reverse attribute ticked, then it will reverse that entire section of railing. So the UVs on this trim are automatically generated. The U coordinate is going to be based on the length of the rail, and you can scale it under the UV settings. You can also adjust the start point of your U coordinates. And then the V coordinates are going to be stored on the vertices of the profile object. And this one is being stored as a float attribute called UV underscore Y. And that gets plugged in the UV settings under profile V attribute. So you can see as I move this around, it's going to change which portion of the trim sheet that it's pulling from. I think for this trim, I'd like to use this section that is concrete. I already have the V values for that written down, so I'm going to quickly punch those in. This is why I had to split up the pieces of the profile curve earlier so we could have like UV splits on the corners of the trim. Cool, that's looking pretty good. I also have a second UV attribute plugged into my profile, and that's because this material uses a second UV set that is mapped to an overlay texture that's got like a grungy gradient on it. And that's going to get overlaid on top of my base color. So that UV underscore Y2 attribute is plugged into my UVs under the second profile V attribute. Now I'm going to move those values around and find some good coordinates for that. And I can also adjust the U scale on the second UV channel. Now it would be really nice if my trim had some end cap pieces on it. So there is a way of adding those. In order to do so under Rail, you enable cap ends with profile shape. And then with that enabled, it's going to look for any polygons that are embedded into our profile object, and then use those as the end cap pieces. So I'm going to duplicate my profile edges, I'll merge the verts together and convert them to a face, and then I'll flip that normal so that the face is pointing in the right direction. I also need to make sure that my profile object also has the trim material applied to it. And then I'm going to do some quick UVs for the end cap. This piece is also going to need a second UV channel. And then let's extrude it. I can delete the faces that I don't want. Then maybe add a nice little bevel on the end there. And now my trim has some decent looking end cap pieces on it. Now let's look at the scale of the trim. We can set the scale in a couple of different ways. Under Profile, there's a Scale Profile Globally setting that will scale the entire trim up and down. And you can choose to either scale it on all three axes, which would be good for wires or cables or pipes, or you can choose to scale it only on the X and Y coordinates, which would be good if you're doing a railing or something that needs to have a specific fixed height. You can also scale the trim individually on the points of the rail. And this requires yet another point attribute. This one I called point underscore scale. And that gets plugged in under scale profile by point. And then by adjusting that, you can inflate or deflate individual portions of your trim. Or you could also use it to make one section of your trim bigger than another section. But I'll just keep mine all the same. And you can see once this is set up and you have these different profile objects made, it's pretty easy to swap in and out different ones and find one that you like. These are some different profiles that I pre-made, and it did take a couple minutes to set up the UV attributes on these. but now that they're finished, it's really nice and convenient to be able to swap in and out different profiles and find the one that best fits my needs. Now, let's take a look at how the tool deals with splitting UVs. So by default, it's going to look by any corner that exceeds a certain angle threshold and insert a UV split there. This is controlled by this very important setting at the top, angle threshold for corners. Any angle smaller than this is going to be treated as a corner. So as I dial it up, I'm going to get more UV seams and less distortion in my texture. And as I dial it back down, I'm going to get more continuous UVs at the cost of more UV distortion. Now, if you need continuous UVs, but you want to reduce the amount of distortion, one thing you can do is turn on Add Holding Edges. And what this is going to do, instead of inserting a split in the UVs on the corners, is it's going to add an edge loop to either side of the corner, and you can change how far they are from the corners themselves. This is basically going to give you less distortion in the straight parts of your trim, and instead it will localize that distortion to the areas around the corners. Another thing that you could do is to add bevels to the corners. Down here, turn on bevel corners, and then you can adjust the width and the number of edge loops on the bevels. There's a threshold in these controls so that it shouldn't be possible to overshoot your bevels too far, but you do have to keep an eye out there that you don't get any overlapping faces. So as you can see, we've got continuous UVs across the bevel, which means that we have distortion on the straight parts of our trim again. So here you have a couple options. You can either switch this from distortion on bevels to distortion on not bevels, which will give you undistorted UVs on your straight segments and distorted UVs around your corners. Or you can choose to split the UVs on either side of the bevel, and that will remove any distortion at the cost of more UV seams. You can also choose to optionally turn off the bevel on individual points. This is controlled by, you guessed it, yet another point attribute. This one I've called bevel mask. It's a Boolean, and I have it plugged here under bevel corner mask. And with this, I can manually disable bevels on the individual points. Now let's look at how we can add struts to the length of our trim. You can see I've got two pre-made struts over here already. You can call them brackets or spacers or whatever you like. In this tool, I'm calling them struts. So I'm going to switch back to this other profile, which will fit the shape of my struts better. And then down in the strut section of my trim, I'm going to turn on use struts, and I'll pick one of my pre-made struts. Maybe I'll go with this other strut instead. You can also choose to use a collection instead of an individual strut, and with that enabled, it will alternate between the struts included in your collection. I can adjust the spacing between the struts and also the distance that they're offset from the corners. I can also rotate my struts. Or I can choose to add some amount of random rotation to each strut. I can even mask off the struts on individual edges of my trim using yet another attribute. This one I've called edge underscore mask. This is a Boolean attribute stored on the edges. And using that, I can turn off struts on particular sections of my trim. I can also turn on align struts to rail, and this doesn't look like it does anything at first, but if I change the height of my rail, you'll be able to see what it does better. So I'm going to add some verticality to my trim. And you can see with that turned off, all of the struts will be parallel to each other. But when I have it turned on, they will follow the direction of the trim in vertical space. You can also choose to add a certain amount of sag to your trim. Under the sag settings, we're going to turn on use sag. And then we can adjust the sag amount to find the right amount of droop to add to the areas between the corners. We can also change the resample amount. You can also turn on fan sag, which means that the width of your trim will no longer be perfectly uniform, but you get these edge loops that follow the flow of the rail. They're evenly spaced rather than being perfectly parallel, which can be desirable depending on what it is you're making. I'll turn on use struts again. By default, the struts are parallel to each other, but if you turn on align struts to rail, they will follow the direction of that sag. Lastly, the tool has some special behaviors for placing objects either on the corners or the ends of the trim. Here I have a gate that I started working on. It has some struts applied to the sections. We'll address the spacing distance from the corners. Maybe choose to alternate between different strut types. And down here under posts, I can turn on ends and corners, and that will allow me to set a custom post for my corners and a different custom post for the ends of my rail. I hope this guide was useful, and if you liked this video, you're welcome.